For anyone who's interested in picking up systems and subjects, I think what that book is going to give you is, on the one hand, a creative engagement between two mega discourses. On the one hand, the system science, on the other hand, the continental philosophy. And then, as sort of like an implicit background, what's going on there is sort of like a creative exploration of dialectical and speculative logic. So if you're interested in that type of thing, that's what Systems and Subjects is trying to bring to the conversation.
Hello and welcome back. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Cadell Last. Cadell Last is a philosopher and is the founder of an online educational platform called Philosophy Portal. Cadell has background in several fields, including anthropology, systems theory, and continental philosophy. His first book was Global Brain Singularity, which was about knowledge and civilization and how those things unfold over time. He also co-authored another book called Sex, Masculinity, and God, which is an attempt to connect spirituality to the study of or an understanding of sexuality and masculinity. He also has more recently 2 edited volumes, anthologies. One of them is based on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, a conference that he organized based on that book. That's called Enter the Alien, Thinking the 21st Century Hegel. And after that, there's another anthology called Abyssal Arrows, which was inspired by Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That one is, the subtitle for that one, interestingly, is Spiritual Leadership, inspired by Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Those 2 anthologies, I talked about them, they're based on conferences, and they're both projects that were organized through Philosophy Portal. At Philosophy Portal, Cadell and his colleagues, they also offer courses on philosophy and psychoanalytic theory. I put the link below and I encourage you to check it out. Right now, here we are going to talk a little bit about his own recent book, Systems and Subjects, Thinking the Foundations of Science and Philosophy. What I found in this book was it's very readable, it's very accessible and inviting to newcomers. It's not simplistic at all. It is not sacrificing complexity for the sake of being accessible, but it remains approachable and accessible. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Cadell, is a potential traps involved in this type of project, traps that you should be careful not to fall into, or other people who are, they want to do similar things. Because of how ambitious this project is, you're putting one thinker, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, and his systems theory into dialogue with 4 other major thinkers. So maybe we can start with that, the potential traps, the things that you wanted to avoid, you were conscious of. It's like, okay, I don't want to go there, or I don't want to do this. Maybe we can start there. And also welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to be here, Davood, and yeah, thank you for that introduction. And just jumping right into the heart with a very difficult question, which is, I'm enjoying what emotions this question is bringing up for me. And I often reference, what's coming to my mind is something I always reference actually from David Bowie, which is this metaphor of creativity. And the metaphor is something like, for Bowie anyway, you don't want to be standing on the beach, and you don't want to be in the middle of the ocean. You want to be just with your toes touching the bottom of the sand and your head just above the water. And he says that's the place where, that's the tension where you're not bored on the beach and you're not dead in the middle of the ocean, but you're struggling in a creative place where something might happen which you surprise yourself, even would say your capacity metaphorically to swim at that depth. And Systems and Subjects is certainly, I was there. I don't know if I was, while I was writing it, and while I was reviewing it, I don't know if I was a few meters too deep or not, but I was certainly pushing it. And that is a danger. That is a danger. And I think the danger is that you say a lot, but you say nothing. I think that's the danger. And if you say a lot but you say nothing, Basically, you're just talking to yourself. In the end, you're just conceptualizing in the void, and there's not going to be any either response or reaction or cultural intellectual impact to your work, because there's really no one who can receive it. On the other hand, if I was playing devil's advocate with that, I think there are many great philosophical texts which are notoriously difficult to read and interpret, and which have been under long-term philosophical investigation for centuries, precisely because it's not something like a New York Times bestseller where you can just pick it up and spend an afternoon reading it, and you get the main point, and then you can go off to the next New York Times bestseller, right? So there are some philosophical texts which, in my view, there are some living philosophers today who are writing texts where I guarantee you that no one really understands them, or where the readership does not yet exist. Sometimes I feel like with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the readership is only emerging. Not that no one has understood it before, but just saying there's a certain spirit and a certain intensity in that book, which I still think the readership is emerging for such intensity, and a readership is emerging for such spirit, for example. Or I often joke that Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is like a tweet which takes 200 years to understand. There's a certain conception, and this is part of entering philosophy on some level, is I think that you're entering a different level of conversation. It's a conversation which is going on over the course of centuries, and I think that there's a certain very strange contradiction at work in our current social ecology with the internet, where you have this coincidence between instantaneous media like Twitter, Instagram, where all of our attention gets sucked up, and where people post memes and daily blog content and stuff, and then philosophical texts, which is, like I say, might need a few centuries to digest, as a species being. And I do think, as a species being, so I think that the book is yeah, I sort of feel like it's in that space, not like in the sense of, I don't want to say putting myself on such a level like that, but just that it has the ambitions and the depths that I do think just simply require a lot on the reader in terms of time, and that I'm looking for a certain type of reader who is willing and in a certain space of openness to receive that. But before passing it back on to you, I just want to say that as complex as the book may appear in certain from certain angles, there is really one actual goal in the book, and that is to apply almost like a meta dialectic to, on the one hand, system science or general science, and on the other hand, continental philosophy. And the reason I'm doing that is because I saw an opening for that conversation, and on the other hand, I think that conversation is long overdue. So that's what I was going for.
Yeah, definitely. Going through the writing, it really does come across that this project is motivated. You feel the motivation for it. And something else that I would like to return to later on is how much reading the book made me think about you, like to think about you as a person and how you conduct yourself, how you relate to other people. We will get to that later. I want to specifically ask you about that when we talk about one of the big themes in the book, which is open and closed systems, and systems that are doomed to fail if they remain closed, and how that made me think a lot about how your openness in the way you conduct yourself in philosophical philosophical conversations and situations. I wanted to, I guess, ask you a little bit more. Maybe this might be a bit technical, but I'm curious about that process of how to put one thinker in dialogue with another. Now, that might seem like something that is very strange to do, but we do this implicitly, and correct me if I'm wrong. When we pick up a book and read it, we're already doing that dialogue, that process of dialogue. I'm putting my own mind in dialogue with some other reader. And in the beginning, that dialogue might be asymmetrical. Your own mind might be too dominant in that dialogue, might be a louder voice. But the more you read the author, the more of their other books you read, the more you learn about them, the voice of your own mind becomes more toned down, becomes quieter, and allows room for this other author. Now you take that to a new level. You know, you do something that is like you put yourself as kind of a referee, and you add multiple authors, multiple thinkers. And so how do you manage them? I guess the concept of referee, the metaphor of referee it makes sense because you are kind of not letting one of them to over-dominate over others. So that temptation, which might be there, is also something I was curious if you would address.
Well, I like that metaphor of the referee. And I might be tempted to even take that to play with that a little bit, in the sense of when you're talking about the mind, which is perhaps overly dominant when you're reading someone else, is that might be kind of like the stage of being an athlete. It's like when you're an athlete, you're in the game and you can't, as it were, see the game. You're in the game and you see your position in the game, but you don't see the larger stakes. You don't see the relations of all the players and the team and the larger context. Whereas the referee's kind of in the game, outside the game, and the referee sees the game, and the referee's whole telos is the game, and a good referee. So that metaphor is interesting to think through in this context. Now,
and one more thing, sorry, the players want to push against the rules. And if possible, they want to get away, bending or breaking the rules. It's like
right.
a philosopher wants to like push in and get more space. But the referee actually is an agent of the rules too. Sorry, go ahead. Back to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, there definitely is a different positionality in relationship to the rules, which is interesting to think about. In regards to your initial question there with this the relationship between, let's say, the dialogue in our mind and then the larger philosophical dialogue, something I've tried to do since basically becoming interested in continental philosophy was what I first noticed in the difference between the discourse of continental philosophy and the discourse of science, because I first was studying science and was familiar mostly only with the scientific literature, was the way in which people in continental philosophy are constantly engaging with others, at least in the discourse. Like Lacan says this, and Bataille says this, and and it'll always be for this person this. It's never this. It's never just this. It's for this person this. And it took a while to sort of to even understand why that's happening. Like I often thought when I was first reading continental philosophy, why is it like this? Why is it so different? Why is the discourse so different than the scientific discourse? But I think there is like a metaphysical logical difference, where really I think continental philosophy, I do think it's coming from the German idealists, and maybe it goes just further back to ancient philosophy, but there's a sense of really including the subject in the discourse, and that object, yes, there is an objectivity, but that objectivity includes a perspectival shift from many subjects. And that doesn't mean that every subject is equal. It's not like undergrad student X says this and Foucault says this is equal. Like, no, it's not like that. And, there is weird fractal hierarchy here at work between different thinkers, and but nonetheless the objectivity is fully including the subjectivity. And that's something I wanted to bring. That type of way of thinking is something I wanted to bring to the scientific discourse as well, encouraging people maybe more on that scientific end to include that way of thinking, including the subject in the system.
Mhm.
But then also on the other hand, for the continental philosophy, like to bring more maybe systematic methodological thought to the subject. But what I do basically to make sure that my voice, now when I'm writing, it is my voice and it's me taking certain speculative liberties. But when I'm studying these thinkers, I try to be blank and empty. And like for example, when I'm teaching phenomenology of spirit, or when I'm teaching Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I'm really trying to stay very true to the text. And it's sort of about getting rid of Cadell as much as possible and letting that text come to life now, and letting it move through me and taking a back seat for a second. And like I did the same thing, for example, with Bertalanffy when I was reading through his foundational text. But then once you do that, once you empty yourself and you let that text move through you, it's almost like then that text paradoxically becomes a part of you.
Mhm.
And then you can sort of, then you can take more speculative liberties with it. You can bring that text to whatever particular problems are of interest to you. So like, for example, for me, I'm very interested in that conversation between, on the one hand, this generalist, interdisciplinary complexity science, system science. You know, there is a tendency in science to move out of reductionism towards a more holistic way of thinking. And then on the other hand, the philosophical tradition, where I feel like even the holistic sciences, they don't really know this tradition. It's almost like these are just living in two different worlds,
Mhm.
these discourses. And at the same time, they're very, very powerful discourses. So I'm just like, and I just saw openings for dialogue. So that's sort of where my voice, that's where my particularity does come into the picture.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, great. And what you're adding to that is the voices of continental philosophy, like the Heidegger, might not be as concerned as you are with sciences, with this, with what scientists are doing. Or Nietzsche, similarly, they might not be as concerned. So you're adding their work, their spirits, bringing them into a new field, and adding to that your drive to kind of for them to speak to each other, for these two sides. Not as like, okay, let's just neutrally, in a neutral way, put these two people or these two voices side by side. There's a drive to put these perspectives into dialogue, and that is to me very mysterious. We don't really have a way of identifying where these drives come from. It's just, as you said, it's a particularity of what you bring to the table. Okay. You begin the book, or the book begins, or you both, the book begins with these distinctions. You introduce really nicely the idea of a cut, which is what we do sometimes to organize our field of knowledge. So a cut, for example, comes between the inner world and the outer world, the Cartesian interior and then the physical exterior. And then these two, because of that cut, that we take further steps to say, okay, this world is subject to, or is the object of these set of rules. This is how it is being regulated. This other side is being regulated, and it's subject to these laws. And they're two different set of laws. And so science is, with this, like you very quickly give the reader an inkling of how science has come about. They come about with these kinds of cuts, and then the separation of concepts and entities and fields, and then each field comes up with their own set of rules or laws. And for the short term, they seem very successful because they have simplified and isolated themselves. But we will find other things in the long term. What is also really effective in your presentation is that you show these cuts are contingent, that it doesn't need to be this way, the inner outer. I think you elaborate, and later on throughout the book, you replace it with two attitudes of the physical sciences, or the maybe based on the Newtonian physics. And on the other side, you have the evolutionary attitude, the attitude that is about change, but then doesn't have the same level of stability. And interestingly enough, you put religion, the attitude of religion together on the side of physics. And you point out what they have in common is that they remove that role of the subject, remove what the subject does in determining this field. So anything about this, any elaboration on this concept of the cut and its role in organization of fields and sciences?
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, indeed, that's sort of where I see the starting point of this discussion on the foundations of science and philosophy. So the subtitle of the book is "Thinking the Foundations of Science and Philosophy," and I think, at least in the traditional narrative that we have set up, and which I do see, this traditional narrative that's set up, which I do think stems back to like Newton and Descartes, some other figures. I do think that the discourse is as it were, that's the umbilical cord of the discourse, or that's the that's the
Mm.
that's the cut of the discourse, that it's coming from there. Like, even if you read contemporary quantum gravity papers, they're constantly wrestling with the Newtonian background problem.
Mm.
Like, it's always in, like, the Newtonian background is always is always a metaphysical problem. So yeah, it's like this. It's interesting that, like, wherever a discourse starts, it's kind of hard to get rid of the origin of it. Like, it's kind of like you're stuck with the origin of it, and you've got to tarry with the origin of it, even if you're quite a far distance away from it, like in the case of quantum gravity. um but even in, like, for example, the continental tradition, I mean, I think in the continental tradition, when you read figures like Hegel, like Heidegger, like Lacan, like Badiou, you see Descartes just there. Like, Descartes is there. And so in the same way, like, there's an interesting way. And even, like, for example, I know you've studied I'm doing some book clubs on Kant. It's like, even when you go to the, like, furthest limits of Hegel's writing, like, Kant's synthetic a priori is still there. It's like, there's not, like, so in some sense, like, these origin seed ideas that start a discourse, they, again, it's
Yeah.
kind of similar to how I think in psychoanalysis we never really get rid of that image of the primordial other as mother.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no matter how far in your development you are, like spiritual guru, whatever, like, the mother, like, and the power of the mother is still there.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I'd like to bring that into the idea of the cut. The idea of the cut being almost like a primordial division or a primordial judgment, which, as it were, opens the possibility for the mediation of a body of knowledge. And in regards to modern knowledge and what has become science and philosophy, is we should remember that the original body of the cut was natural philosophy. So, like, Newton's work was a natural philosophy, and Descartes would see himself as a natural philosopher. So it's almost like science grew out of natural philosophy in this original cut, and then two worlds have in some sense existed in parallel beside each other. And I think the crucial distinction on this cut is the cut between inside and outside. And I think that's why there's a lot of discourse today in various circles that are constantly thinking about the unity of the subject and the object. Like, can we think of a discourse that unifies the subject and the object? And there are various terms that we could think of related to the unity of subject and object. But I think what I wanted to bring it to in the text anyway was this feeling of an interiority, and this feeling of an interiority in relationship to the feeling of an exteriority, which is, as it were, indifferent, unrelated to us. And I think that sets up the conditions for modern physics, and also in philosophical terms, traditions which have become more subjectivist, phenomenological, existentialist, and so forth. And so thinking along that cut, and then maybe, and maybe this text points in that direction or not, is what would be a different type of cut? What would be a different type of cut which starts with different presuppositions, which allow us to see the inside and the outside as one thing? Maybe we need a more complex way of thinking even about that. I'm open to that as well. And then finally, this question of on the one hand physics, on the other hand evolutionary sciences. It's almost as if, because of the original cut in physics, and because the original cut was in physics, that the life sciences and the biological sciences are always kind of they have this physics envy. And so it's almost like it's hard for the evolutionary scientists, and I do think it's changing, but it's hard for the evolutionary scientists to really ground their own ontology as not as it were playing within a physics foundation. Mm-hmm. Like that evolution, that everything is, and again, this brings us back to reductionism, and this brings us back to perhaps, like, say, the hegemony of neo-Darwinian traditions, which are fundamentally reductionist, which avoid and ignore certain problems that I think is more and more important, like thinking, for example, about the evolution of religion as fundamental, for example. Like, I always thought I think that's increasingly an issue, that evolutionary scientists, the way in which they approach society, the way in which they approach human socio-historical phenomena, to me seems increasingly untenable to continue to have an evolutionary worldview which is unable to really approach the real of socio-historical processes.
Yeah, I used to interact a lot with neuroscientists and cognitive scientists, and I had, in many of them, I sensed this. They would openly say that they ultimately want for whatever they say to be modeled, and in that model, they have a predictable mechanism that would create predictions, create hypotheses, and then it will be testable, and they would have no role in it. So it would be as if anybody could offer that model, and the model has to stand on its own, based on its own merits. In your book, there's I think in chapters 3 or 4, you have this passage of you want to see, okay, where are you, Mr. Scientist, in your model? Why doesn't your model, if it is so great, if it is so perfect, if it has such predictive value, why doesn't it say anything about you? Why is it completely silent about the person who has designed it? And then here, the voice of that side, the scientist's voice, will say, no, I want to be gone. That's what I want. So here we have a disagreement. Maybe here we have a cut between two different sentiments, two different desires. One of them doesn't want to be included. And I wonder if that's a kind of, it's not just a physics envy, or a desire for such a powerful phallic agent that you don't need to be there anymore. We might also describe that as like a kind of death drive. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that. But that thing that you describe about the model being able to incorporate the person who has designed it, that's something I agree with. But what can we do about people who kind of disagree fundamentally with that?
I think that's what simply brings us back to this original cut, because if we follow the line of the original cut of, let's say, thinking about absolute space and time, um and thinking about absolute space and time in a deterministic system, where basically the system is already complete, like nothing new, like, and that's the interesting thing, is that it's very hard for science to, for example, think about the new or think about creativity. And it's not that there aren't ideas here, it's just that the what we're working within is an original cut, which doesn't include the space or the possibility to even think that in the first place. So it's kind of like, and the consequences is that you do get this image of a world, and you get this, and it's built into the very desire of science, like you mentioned, which is to desire for a knowledge in which I'm not present, to desire a knowledge in which I become absent. And just because I didn't fully touch on it last time, I want to bring up that that's sort of where I see, paradoxically, the foundation and the original cut of physics and natural philosophy as somewhat mirroring the ontology and the metaphysics of traditional religion, where you have this image of it's just maybe a little more depersonalized, where in traditional religion you have this image of a total being, a total knowledge of God, who's all knowing, all perfect, all everything, omni everything. And I am not. I'm nothing in comparison to God. And so it's kind of like the absolute notion of God, and this is something I sort of play with throughout the text, like the absolute notion of God becomes the absolute notion of space and time. It's like the absolute notion of God as supernatural, grounding that metaphysics, and the absolute notion of space-time grounding that metaphysics. It's almost like we move in that transition, we move, like, I always think, what is the historical function of thinking in these different ways? It's almost like human beings with absolute space and time are trying to orient and locate themselves in the world, in the natural world. Like, let's make space and time the primary signifiers, and let's make sure we know where we are spatially and temporally. But then not really thinking about, once we've sort of gotten a spatio-temporal location of ourselves, then what? Then what happens? Right? And that's not something that's really thought through. And it could be, like, for me, in studying the difference between Kant and Hegel a lot of the times, to me, it comes down to the relationship between self-reflection and fear and terror. So, like, that I don't know if I'm right, but like, what I take as, in studying psychoanalysis, the difference between science and psychoanalysis is that um looking within, or self-reflecting, and being willing to include oneself in the investigation towards objectivity, does involve confrontation with negative emotions, negative affects. So is the desire to exclude oneself actually a obfuscation and in some sense, a shirking of responsibility, to move through negative affect in such a way as that you have a better understanding of what you really are? And then you'd have to ask yourself very difficult questions if you were to include yourself in the model. And I think that's what I like about your thesis as well in your book, is that in bringing science to a more reflective level, you all of a sudden have to ask yourself questions like, why am I doing this research to begin with? What is the motivations of this research? All of these more questions of including yourself while you're doing it. And I just want to, before passing it back to you, I just want to say one thing about, I encountered this experientially in my process of coming to be a scientist and a philosopher, is that when I was in my master's program, I had to make many compromises to get into my master's program at the level that I was doing. And I ended up doing a research project that I had no interest in motivation in doing. I was studying lemurs, and I just didn't have any interest in that. Now, if I was to continue doing that, I think that what I would have had to sacrifice to continue doing that is precisely to remove myself, because that's not really where my heart is. That's not really what I'm interested in doing. Like, what I saw was like, basically the split that I was tarrying with was like, why am I spending all my professional time studying X, Y, or Z phenomenon that I'm not too motivated to study? And then when I'm with my friends or when I'm outside of my professional life, I'm talking about this, all sorts of other things, which I'm
Yeah.
really interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what I took on myself was, how can I get that closer together? Right? How can I, but now when you do that and when you really go deep into that, and that process, at least from my experience, that process never really ends, because it's always something that I'm re-coordinating. Like I've always got to re-coordinate if I'm on track, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't constantly re-coordinate if I'm on track, I could easily fall back off track and I could easily split myself again.
Mm-hmm.
So this is some ideas about maybe the responsibility for the death drive.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to kind of stay with something you mentioned here, and I want to point out also that your book gives us some resources to think about this problem. You said that you were given a project to work on that you were not really excited about. The flip side of that, I experienced something else that is related to that. That is, I presented something to my supervisors in preparation for a conference. And in response, they said, yeah, the content is good. Just be more excited about this. I said, what does that mean? This is not that important. It's not very groundbreaking. Why would I pretend to be excited about something? It was like I was also just coming out of my master's program. I wasn't working on some big project. Why would I pretend? You know what I mean? So by pretending something is more exciting, I'm kind of compromising my inner compass. If there is that inner compass that really allows me to feel excited about something. Similarly, if you're forced to, or if you're really urged to work on something that you're not excited about, you are kind of compromising, hurting your inner compass that you need later on to be guided by. And it is, again, now going back to your book, here we see that this kind of thing is based on a naive Cartesianism, very naive idea that I can keep this to myself secretly. I can keep what I'm really excited about to myself and then pretend to be this other scientist and be excited about that. But if we really think about what we are doing, our participation in systems terms, that no, I'm not just this inner thing. I am what I do. I am my participation. Whatever I participate is going to influence my interior life as well. That cut doesn't really exist in our being. The inner and outer are really a dance, an interplay. So I just wanted to say, just signal my agreement, and then the resources here to think through these contradictions. Going back to that scientist and their desire to be absent, I think we could also read that as a desire to be omnipresent. To say, my model, the model that I created is so amazing that I am now immortal. So at the same time, they are accepting a kind of death, a kind of absence that guarantees that they're going to be there forever. And that brings us to chapter 3 of your book, which is the will to power, and how Nietzsche very astutely was such a perceptive observer that he kind of diagnosed a lot of times, a lot of claims, a lot of behaviors as expressions of will to power in disguise. So scientists might be, again, naive to this, even though they are so advanced technologically, but they're not able to think in terms of, will to power, and that as their participation, they drive in how they are participating in a system that is a scientific field.
No, I totally agree with what you're framing there in regards to the scientist, and the desire to be absent is at the same time a desire for omnipotence. It's an omnipotence in which their omnipotence becomes manifest in basically in a predicate or a presupposition. They as a subject are absent, but this predicate, absolute space and time, or whatever the concept is, can even be the concept of evolution, or the concept of the psyche, and not the psyche, but the concept of the psyche. It just becomes a predicate, and then it's an omnipresent predicate. And I think the crucial thing here, like the idea of systems and subjects, is that you've got to keep that tension between system and subject, or you got to keep that tension between subject and predicate. So it's not that, for example, space and time or evolution or psyche is just not a useful predicate, or even a very powerful predicate, or in Nietzsche's sense, the will to power. Yeah, I mean, you've got to keep yourself involved, entangled, engaged with the thing. That you are in some sense in a loop with this thing. And again, I think that just means that you've got to confront potentially your own death drive, which is, do I really want to be absent? Right? In that sense, right? Do I really want to be, do I really want to be alive? And this is something, for all of thinking about like Nietzsche's very life affirmationalist, there are some parts in Thus Spoke Zarathustra towards the end of the third part where he's like in, like, I think, an intimate partner conflict with life itself. And life is saying, you don't love me as much as you say you love me, and you're going to leave me soon. It was almost like a husband and wife arguing. And but this idea that you have to confront that dimension of yourself, right? Like, and yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing on that, which is just for the moment escaping me, which is, yeah, just escaping me, but it's
no.
It'll come as soon as I stop talking.
Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoyed that treatment of mortality and the denial of our own mortality. That a lot of people act as if they don't die, but a lot of people act as if there is some other person out there who never dies, and they're living as if that, and that really changes things. That really changes how we engage with our life, how we engage with philosophy, how we engage with science. If we assume that there is a perspective of an immortal person or an immortal group of people who will be the judges, I think Kant had a little bit of that when he's talking about universal history with cosmopolitan intent. He is having in mind an image of a future of ever-present beings. Maybe I'm misreading him, but that denial of death, that we should accept our own mortality, we should accept death, and then incorporate that. That's much harder than it sounds in practice, to really incorporate the fact of our mortality. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I did remember what I wanted to say, and I can connect it to that. But I like that reading there that you just offered of the sneakiness of the perspective of an immortal person that will be the judges. In some sense, it's not just a feature of, let's say, Christianity or something. It's not, even if you're not Christian, this can sneak in and somehow operate in your worldview. But it was basically in relationship to science and the universal view and the absence of the scientist. Is that after my doctoral thesis, after writing my doctoral thesis in an interdisciplinary science department, and sort of exploring that the potentialities of that worldview and so forth, is that I basically came to thinking about lack and absence. Like that was the dominant strain of thought after finishing my doctorate, and that's sort of what ended up leading to the philosophy of lack series that I did with our friends Daniel Garner, Tim Adlin, and Alex Ebert. But where that originally came for me anyway was I was just like exploring like the phenomenology, the experience of lack in my own life. So like I would like I did some, like, looking back on it now, like I had conditioned my body to such extremes that I can't do them anymore. But like I would like I fasted for like 5 days one time. I did a dry fast for 3 days. I would play around with how far I could go without sleeping, or alternatively play around with sleeping for extra long periods of time, or abstinence, or they call colloquially no fap, so like just not ejaculating for an extended period of time.
Mhm.
um Different meditation, different things like this, but basically different ways to accommodate the drive or learn about the drives of the body in relationship to the lack of an object.
Mhm.
And so that is something that I really believe that you like. Okay, I've read a lot about lack and stuff philosophically, psychoanalytically, but I still don't think that it's the same as if you have to go through that experientially as well. It's something that you move through, and um it just changes you as a it just changes you as a subject, I think.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's an other side to lack. Like, you can't just stay in lack like forever. Well, you can, I guess, but it seems to me like there's something about the drive which just keeps going and keeps going. And
Mhm.
you just have, it's almost like nothing changes and everything changes. Like, you still eat, you still sleep, you still engage in sex, you accept your sexuality, or all of these things. But it's almost like the perspective changes in regards to I guess your self-understanding.
Mhm. Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that you had these practices. To it seems to me that what you do, what is common in all those practices or those physical challenges, is that you're moving yourself away from states of equilibrium. And by doing that, you're moving your way away from the way you see the world when you are in a state of equilibrium. And you're finding new ways of seeing, new ways of perceiving and engaging. So when somebody who's always been in a state of equilibrium, has always had food, always had their needs met, when they talk about the lack of meaning in their life or the meaning crisis, that's a totally different perspective. I mean, I'm not uh, rejecting that or saying that it's not valid. It is valid, but uh, it is coming from a perspective that is not aware of its own potential, that is not aware of all these possible spaces that they can occupy. The place of extreme hunger, place of extreme isolation, for example, or being in a place where there is not much sensory stimulation going on, like a prison cell for 2 months. Uh, so is it true? Like, would you say that because it raises the question why you would do something like that? One of them is to understand lack, sure. But is it also possible to move yourself to these states away from equilibrium to cultivate openness uh, in yourself, openness to others, openness to the world? Because if you're in equilibrium, you don't really need to engage as much. You already have, you know, there's no intense lack.
So we can use those signifiers of I mean, what comes up a lot in the book is equilibrium and far from equilibrium states. And um I remember the first day I started doing the fasting experiment, which ended up unfolding for like about 2 years. The first day I was in tears because, and I just was reflecting on, wow, every day of my life I've eaten food. I've never gone a day without eating food. This is the first day I've gone without it. This is the first 24-hour cycle where I haven't eaten food.
Mhm.
And I'm throwing a temper tantrum.
Mhm.
I'm throwing a temper tantrum. So I'm confronting to me with food in particular. And I think there is a particularity with me, but I also think there's a generality with like the oral drive, and like the way we come into this world as babies, and the oral drive being operative from the beginning. Is that the oral drive is challenges you with the infantile psyche very, very deeply. So I think on the one hand, throwing yourself out of equilibrium in regards to, for example, eating food every day, it is going to throw you into a far from equilibrium state in the regards to you're encountering a new tension. And you're encountering a certain tension with layers of your emotionality, which probably have never been seriously triggered. For maybe, in my case, it was 3 decades. So that is going to open you up to new perspectives. And I don't fully know what I was doing with all of that, but it was certainly, like, if I was to take a stab at theorizing what was going on in that stage of my life, it was it was also involving minimalism, subtracting objects, subtracting possessions, subtracting, even a little experiment with homelessness, subtracting home. I think it was a lot to do with taking responsibility for the death drive, that all of the things that I had attached to in the world did not, as it were, work. Like something was wrong. Something was wrong deeply. And the only thing to do was, I felt like, wipe the slate clean and, as it were, start from ground zero and reassess what I am on a primal level, reassess what I am on a originary level. Now that's me retroactively theorizing. I don't know if that's, I think there were a lot of emotions in the moment which were in that direction, and it was, I think a lot of it was to do with the collapse, actually, with a certain transcendental set of categories. So, like, basically having a set of transcendental categories which were let's say, derived by my very academic path. Like the path that I went on to become an academic, whether they're super conscious, whether they're unconscious, I had a certain image of what my life was going to be like and where I was going to go and how I was going to be recognized and what I was going to, the type of lifestyle I would be able to have and stuff like that. And it was just like confronting the dissolution of all of that imagery, and then sort of needing to totally rethink from the ground up. And to me, that was ultimately, now I would say it's like taking responsibility for Death Drive, because it's sort of taking responsibility for those parts of yourself which do want to be absent. Even though you don't know it. And then what you have to do basically is turn that emotion inside out and be with absence as such.
Yeah, that's great. Wow. Yeah, this is we could relate this idea to a lot of different areas in our lives. For example, social media. Like the desire to disappear is something that I've experienced because of being involved in social media. Like creating a rhythm of, let's say, you're posting a YouTube video every week. There is something that arises in you when you have that. There's something that arises in you that I can only call the desire to disappear, or the desire to go back to a state before this, because you don't want to be dominated by this this external rule of, you are doing this, you are being present in the public in this form, in this with this platform, you're engaging with this platform in this form, which is if you really take it too seriously, it becomes the denial of absence, and the denial of the capacity to be absent and disengaged and just disappear. So yeah, that's
yeah, no, I agree with that, and I constantly struggle with that myself. And I think social media probably were, I don't think it's too much to assume that we're voicing emotions that many people experience with social media, as regards to a desire to disappear, and at the same time feeling like you're controlled and dominated by this thing. And that's something that I would say the deepest, now, after having gone through, let's say, the quasi dissolution of that academic image, and in some sense owning the drive of trying to do it in my own way, in my own path,
Mm-hmm.
is basically the result. Is you know, you move from being dominated by the academic structure to being dominated by the new big other as the social media structure. And so, in some sense, you're dealing with a problem which is different, but also in terms of form, quite similar in some sense. And I think the dominant tension I struggle with, the dominant emotion I struggle with is, on the one hand, loving what I do, but on the other hand, feeling like being enslaved by the conditions upon which I have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's offering courses, whether that's engaging in marketing, advertising, trying to balance the love for what I do with practical necessities of life, building a life, these types of things, and that tension leading to the emotion of I just want to disappear sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes there's a meme on one of the theorygram meme sites, which is related to, I think it's called Freudian intensities. There's this meme that said, I thought I was just tired, but it's more than that.
Wow.
Like basically I thought I just needed an extra night's sleep,
Oh yeah.
but actually it's more than that. I'm tired for some other reason. And that tiredness to me, like sometimes, like for example, you just want to roll up in bed and just hug the pillow for the whole afternoon.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, great, great. So now I want to get to I have a couple more questions, um, at least, and then other things that might come up. I love this discussion of closed systems and open systems. And this was something that in the book, it made me think of you the most, like remembering you as a person, because that always struck me when, watching your YouTube videos, especially watching your conversations, because there were people that you engage with. And I would say, Cadell, like, where does he set the boundary? Like, are there people that he wouldn't talk to? Like, why is he doing? Or, that kind of reaction, you know what I'm talking about. It's a kind of judgmental on my part. And for me, it's kind of indicating that I'm more closed. I'm much more closed. And there are certain things that I wouldn't do with people that I wouldn't engage with in such a serious way that you do. You not only engage, but you seriously engage. And so you have a very wide range of engagement. You take a lot of risks, and uh, both in the material, in uh, in people, and in yourself. So it's always like people who are less judgmental about other people, they're also more inclusive and less judgmental about themselves. So you're also more open to being vulnerable, discussing your vulnerabilities and using them as material. So I was really like, this really inspired me to try to practice more openness, to be a more open system, because it has consequences. You can't be closed system. That's just an ideological state that gets increasingly out of touch with the outside world, and it denies the fact that the outside world is changing. So again, the way I'm talking now seems like this is the book has some advice, but no, it's more descriptive. It's very descriptive, but you can read that, you can kind of translate that in your mind, in a somewhat, if you need it, like I do, in a more prescriptive way. So I wonder what you were thinking. Was that something that you consciously do, or is it more like a temperament that you have, this openness that is great?
Mm. No, it's a super good question. It's super fun to think about. I definitely don't have all the answers about myself, but it's interesting, you know. I guess what's happened, I will I will say that I think traditionally I've been sexually, intimately more on the closed end, and I've been politically, socially more on the open end. Traditionally, since I was a young man. Then after I started to experiment with psychedelics in my early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, I had a radical openness in me. And it was almost like, again, going back to ground zero and rethinking from and just experimenting with almost like why is my boundaries, like when you were saying with regards to philosophical conversations, like where is the boundary? It was kind of like me, again, retroactively saying this, not consciously in the moment, but like almost saying, where is the boundary? Like where is the boundary of my why would I relate like this and not like this, or why would I relate with that person and not that person, or in this way and not that way? And going back to the ground of that, like intimately and then also intellectually, because I do think they're connected, is I think the boundaries are pain related. I think the boundaries are like that's at least from my analysis of myself is, and the pain is double. I think the pain is pain inside yourself, like being hurt by someone else, but also pain in the other hurting another, right? Like because you could do something which you're fine with but hurts the other person, or someone else could do something that hurts you. And in my experience, those pains are kind of equal. Like being hurt and hurting someone else, to me, I mean, and I guess that just means, oh, I guess I'm not a sociopath. Right? Because like a sociopath would like hurt the other person and be like, it doesn't have any effect on me. But no, I think at least for me, it's something related to the pain boundary. And in regards to intellectual conversations, it's really weird. So like I constantly experience this weird double phenomenon. So when I was presenting on this book at the Bertalan Free Center for System Science, there was like I don't know, like an audience of 20 people or something associated with the group. And one person was like, this is too subjectivist and not systemic enough.
Okay.
And then the other person was like, this is too sciencey, it's not subjective enough. Right? So you can't win, right?
Yeah.
It's like one person wants that, one person wants that. And that happens to me all the time. Like, so for example,
It's exactly like reviews from journals. Like they
yeah.
ask for opposite things. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but so yeah, and that's so true. That's so true. That's I've had that happen in peer review processes as well. It's like damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. But no, like so other ways this happens to me, for example, is like sometimes people will say or see me as a Hegelian, right? But like academic scholarly Hegelians, they don't mess with me. Like they don't mess with me. Or like for like or for example, there are certain people in the Zizekian community that I'll be like, who's this guy? Right? Like, but like I engage with Zizek's thought, right? Like so again, it's always this situation of this where I always say is it's like this not fitting. Like I don't, or like for example, when I was first I was first doing an online course on the Freudian unconscious. I went around London to different Freudian groups because there are a lot of Freudian groups in London to see if they would be interested in engaging or helping promote the course, and they saw me as like an enemy.
Right.
Like, no, this is maybe competition for our services. Right? And fair enough, right? Fair enough. This is very complex. And then on the intellectual level as well, like I found my boundaries. Like I've actually found my boundaries with in being so open to intellectual conversations and stuff like that. I've also kind of found where like I'm kind of against that. Like I'm not going to go there anymore. Like for example, going back to the start of the podcast, like I was having a lot of conversations with people in very extremist burner tantric circles. And I learned something from that and stuff like that, but I'm like, okay, I've sort of, I can see what's going on there, and I'm kind of not with that for various reasons. Or, for example, there are certain fundamentalist religious orientations which I'm kind of okay. I'm kind of closed off from that, for example. Or um, there are also certain system building activities in academia that I close myself off from, or that I, there are boundaries. There are boundaries, but I also do. What I'm trying to say in the book is that there's a dialectics of closeness and openness, and there's not one rule for this. It's like everyone sort of has to figure out in their own path where they close and where they open. And I think that's a super important conversation, because often, like, for example, I'll say one thing before passing it back to you, is there was a guy in my doctoral thesis program who was writing his thesis on open-ended intelligence.
Mm.
And then I made a joke at the end of his presentation saying, part two, what about closure?
Right.
Right, like what, right, like, because
Yeah.
like there's this tendency, like we can ideologically become open without thinking about boundaries, or we can become ideologically closed without thinking about openness. So I think and I think the reason why it's so hard to do both is precisely that you have to constantly keep thinking, and you have to be in sort of touch with the pain boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's actually, it reminds me of one of my favorite definitions of religion that I've ever read. I don't remember unfortunately, the author, but he defined religion and religious practices as activities of boundary drawing and then boundary crossing. So you draw boundaries to play with them, to cross them. And then what I heard in your response was constantly there's a necessity to constantly draw with these boundaries. And that's, in fact, some other person comes to mind here, the author of Finite and Infinite Games. He said that the players of the infinite game play with the boundaries. They don't play within boundaries. They play with the boundaries. Yeah, very inspiring. That aspect, I love that aspect of your book, and along with the others. The one question I wanted to ask you, Nietzsche. I love the way you engage with Nietzsche. Some other academics that I've read or I've heard, they give this impression that Nietzsche was, aside from his philosophical and sociological interests, not interests, but work, he was maybe, or they make it seem as if Nietzsche was primarily a psychological thinker. And I love that you present Nietzsche, a different Nietzsche, which is primarily a political thinker. So I wanted to ask you that double question. Why is it that you think most people kind of, in my view, they defang Nietzsche by making him psychological? Oh, he's like, oh, he uncovers certain hidden motives of philosophers. Okay, that's not all of his project. So why is it that you think they present Nietzsche in that way, under that light? And why do you present him as a political thinker? And how did he, what was the process of him finding that, out of the four corners of the puzzle in your book, how Nietzsche occupied that corner?
Yeah, no, that's I like that observation, and that is the case. I am trying to make Nietzsche more a political thinker. Not that he's not a psychological thinker, but I think the stakes are very high on the political dimension. It's kind of like the chapter 2 is I use Freud for the meta psychology, and then chapter 3 I go into the idea of the will to power and the overman as a political notion.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. Let me say the first thing is I think the reason why I think Nietzsche's a political thinker is because I think he, taking it back to this idea of the cut as like sort of an originary motion, which leads to the emergence of a new discourse. I think Nietzsche is a political cut. Like, I think Nietzsche is all the metaphysics of the politics of of before Nietzsche is Nietzsche's is not what I say, and this is following Badiou a little bit, is that Nietzsche is not capable of supporting any one political program, but he is a cut of a first politics. Like, he's a first political gesture which opens a new political world.
Mm.
He's a first politics, not any political program. And I think that is off we can signify it with death of God theology and stuff like that, but mostly what it is an opening of a power vacuum. It's like Nietzsche saying, it's even like Heidegger said about Nietzsche, like the being with the capital B of the beings is the will to power. That's what Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche's work is.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the first politics is like the traditional Western metaphysics put like truth at the top of the pyramid of Plato and the philosopher kings. And Nietzsche's saying, no, we have to take seriously power. And there's this huge, and because the way we've thought about truth hasn't really incorporated power, all of that truth is false. It's going to fall away to the truth of the will to power. And if we don't take that on board, then we're not going to be able to discover a new truth precisely. A new truth which is capable of and so what I basically do in that chapter is I basically take a look at the post-Nietzschean power vacuum. So like I call them meta horizons. Like the meta horizon of, I say things like capitalism, socialism, nationalism, fascism, communism. All of these isms are different expressions of the will to power in this power vacuum. And we haven't really figured out how this, we haven't been able to think this. Mm-hmm. We've been able to think it on an ideological level. Like I take my position within the system. I'm a good communist subject or I'm a good capitalist subject. But we haven't been able to think about the complexity of the power vacuum as such. And I think as a consequence of that, is basically we just have a universal capitalism, which is kind of unregulated, and the nation states are just becoming increasingly sort of puppets of capital. And democracy, liberal democracy as a foundation is kind of eroding, but at the same time, we don't know how to replace it with anything. So I think the stakes are really high in thinking the meta horizon and thinking about the will to power and the meta horizon. And in that sense, I do see, following, there's a thinker who I follow, Daniel Tutt, who's writing a book on Nietzsche.
Okay.
And it's not out yet, but basically the thesis of that is that we're all kind of living in Nietzsche's world in some sense. And so that's what I would say in regards to Nietzsche, is like he's a first politics. He's like a cut. And in my work leading up to the Thus Spoke Zarathustra course, I did an article analyzing the horizon of Nietzschean interpretation, because there are so many different thinkers that have been influenced by Nietzsche's thought in the 20th century. And so again, just bringing it back to this idea of a cut, I just feel like there are traces of Nietzsche in so many different modern thinkers that we could trace back to him. And I think there is a certain, again, I don't think you can use Nietzsche to sort of, let's say, support the left or support the right or support a certain party line, but you can see a certain political ethos, like a certain overdetermination of an ethos, which is distinct from pre-Nietzschean political thinking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe use Nietzsche to critique and to improve in a critical way any of the positions, any of the available positions.
Yeah, well, I like in Nietzsche, for example, that it's hard to after Nietzsche, it's hard to take theology or science or philosophy or even psychoanalysis to some degree, just in terms of their propositions.
Yes.
Like it's much more this relationship between the will to power and the propositions is like and where are, and bringing it back to the position of the subject, where is your power in this propositional game, right? Like I think what's underestimated, and this is something I've learned from teaching the phenomenology of spirit, and also like sort of learning about the history of German idealism, is we should never underestimate the way in every new generation's coming to be and coming to develop and to come into themselves, is that every self-identity in some sense needs to find a home or a place for itself. And that a lot of the times what people believe or what people profess to believe or the discourses that they structure about themselves a lot of the times it's about finding a place to fit. Like, where's a home for my identity? And of course, I think, like, following what you were saying about the finite and infinite games and like playing with the boundaries instead of playing within boundaries, is that I think that the position of absolute knowing is that you realize that there's no like real home in an absolute sense, but you're kind of at home with the cut, or you're at home with the playing with the boundaries as such.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something that our friend Daniel Garner said in one of his conversations on his channel, on the OG Rose channel. He said he was talking about the distinction between academic philosophy and what we are creating here. I mean, you really spearheading this new form, new style of engaging with philosophical thought. He proposed this distinction that on the one hand, we have academic philosophy, which is debate, still very much debate oriented. So you say Heidegger or Nietzsche, who was right about this issue? Issue of, pick an issue out of the hat, feminism or, political orientation. Who was right? And then the academic philosopher comes up with a position at the end, like leaning towards Heidegger or Nietzsche. But Daniel said that for now, what we are doing, and I think he's inspired by you, by what you have been doing, is that what we are doing is akin to cartography. We are drawing boundaries and finding positions for every philosopher. Like we are doing something, we are creating a space in which everybody has a position. We just need to find where Nietzsche falls in our map. Where is the place of Heidegger? Where is the place of, Bertalanffy? Fee? And that's very different from excluding and saying, I favor this or I favor that. That's this is in the spirit of we're all together. We're all doing some work. Let's interpret each other and others, be thinkers of our past, as best as we can. And this is something that it is exemplified in your book, because you're not taking side with any of these five thinkers. You are kind of arranging them in relation to each other, and that's very different. And it makes sense that you are not a traditional in a conventional academic fields.
Yeah, I like that. Actually, it's bringing up something that is actually related to Lacan's logic of the masculine and the feminine logic. So I don't know if well, I'll go into it anyway, just in case the people listening might not know too much about it. But very simplified is that masculine logic for Lacan functions on the all with an exception. So in other words, I'm a Heideggerian, and I have to be a Heideggerian by accepting this. I have to cut this philosopher out, right? Whereas the feminine logic is what he calls the non-all, which is basically a multiplicity without exception. So I think, and now I'm not trying to say, oh, we should privilege the feminine logic over the masculine logic, or we should privilege the masculine logic over the feminine logic. I think they both have a place by definition, because the world is men and women. The world is, and these logics have a that I have seen shortcomings of feminine logic in the sense of just a multiplicity with no exceptions and no boundaries. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's a problem with the masculine logic, which creates an all and then it totally excludes, on the condition that it can totally exclude. Mm-hmm. But there could be a way in which the academic logic was overly biased towards the masculine logic. And I've seen this actually play out in my own experience in academia, where me and some of my colleagues were in a department which was definitely structured by the masculine logic of an all with an exception. And then in order to find a place for ourselves, we created the school of thinking, which was operating on a feminine logic, which was kind of like a multiplicity of different ways of thinking with no exception. And so these logics sort of need to be thought together. And I do think that we can think about this in regards, that's, I think, so that let me just give a little plug for like why I think psychoanalysis is so interesting to bring to philosophy. Like that would be an example of like, we could bring these masculine and feminine logics to the study of philosophy itself, right? Like the way certain like and I think that this tradition goes back pretty far, but um you know, I think in regards to, for example, systems and subjects, I think it is actually a more feminine book, in the sense that I'm just trying to lay out a new multiplicity. I'm not really trying to exclude anything. I'm not trying to come to any final conclusion or final definitive end in the search. I'm just sort of laying open what I think is the field in the search. Um, and then with Philosophy Portal, there is a masculine logic tendency to it, in the sense that there is a line that I'm walking, like, and that is basically, I am, so like with philosophy, then bring it back to the cut idea again. For me, the cut is the thought that's going around the French Revolution, which I think German idealism is the main thought that's going around as a response to the French Revolution. And the line of thought which comes out of that cut. And the reason why it's important is because that thought grounded, I think, the modern liberal democratic world. And I think that world is coming to an end. So we need to study that in order to see what are the conditions of possibility for another world. Mm-hmm. So I think, well, bring it back to after that sort of long digression, I think just, I think this thought of an all with an exception and a non-all with a multiplicity without exception, we need to become comfortable with both types of logic. And that to me is akin to almost understanding on a bodily level. I do think it is down to a bodily level. Like, I think it's down to a bodily level of understanding what it's like to be a man and what it's like to be a woman. Because as a man, in regards to phallic logic, is that, like, like, if I'm really be in my masculinity, my partner is my partner, my all, and you're not allowed in. Mm-hmm. Like, I create a barrier from all the other men. They're excluded, right? I'm not, so that's, but with feminine logic, it's like with the multiplicity without exception, it's almost like all the kids are accepted. Like, I'm gonna make space for all the kids. Mm-hmm. Right? No, except you're in, and you're loved, and you get attention, and you're seen. Yeah. And so I think that both these logics are necessary for a world, basically.
Mm-hmm. Even like the logic of choosing a next king, you have to exclude other sons if the king has multiple sons. It's like the logic of exclusion. When it comes to writing, I really think I've recently been thinking a lot about this, the theme of a mother. And I think every writer, everybody who writes a book is enacting motherhood. And that could be mixed in with different degrees of masculinity. But that element of creating and nurturing something into being, that's undeniably there, present. Could you tell us a little bit more about your courses on Philosophy Portal and how they are related to your philosophy of this philosophy that you've been developing? So how the design of Philosophy Portal is reflecting the principles that you have come to realize over time and develop. So this book might be read as a manifesto of philosophical presence and philosophical engagement.
Yeah, no, so Philosophy Portal, like, if you look from the outside of Philosophy Portal, what you're just gonna see are there are different great thinkers who are there's a hyper concentration on a certain line of great thinkers. What unifies them is that they're all modern thinkers. They're all modern in the political sense more than in the scientific sense, because I see scientific modernity as preceding political modernity. Political modernity is something I see much more related to events like the French and the American Revolution and the end of monarchy and the emergence of a democratic world. And these are thinkers that are within the birth of this world. And I think that the logic of this world has gotten us to basically a globally interconnected state. It has birthed a truly global world. But I think precisely the newness, the qualitative newness of the environment that it has birthed requires new thinking on the level of political totality in order to make sense of what we're really involved in here. And so a lot of what Philosophy Portal is trying to do is to open up a higher order of discourse to engage with those problems, to engage with what I often call as like a return of the problems of the geopolitical, to return to the problems of first principles of science, to return to first principles of religion, to return to first principles of philosophy, and to think something that's really suited to the qualitative newness of our time, as opposed to trying to just haphazardly reconstruct some old system just out of certainty that something we had in the past, something was suited to a different time. I really think that we need philosophical mind. We need to understand philosophical mind in order to engage that project, basically. So the reason why I started with the phenomenology of spirit is because I think what the phenomenology of spirit is trying to do is, I think it's trying to derive what is a philosopher. So it's not trying to say we need philosopher kings or something like that, like a Platonic point of view. It's also not trying to basically derive a certain set of categories, which we then all study. It's trying to derive what does it mean to be a philosophical mind. And so in that sense, that's like a meta project at Philosophy Portal that I think Philosophy Portal is doing its job if new philosophical minds emerge and appear and start differentiating on their own accord. Then with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the logic behind that book was that I think that we have a multiplicity of networks which are poorly organized, and we need to understand, I think, what are the stakes of leadership. What are the stakes? What does it mean to be a leader? And then like a meta question is, what does it mean for leaders to coordinate and network with each other? And I think without understanding that, then we're not going to be able to sustain the multiplicity. Basically, there need to be ones, and they need to be ones who are open to navigating with other ones, basically. And then science of logic is basically the idea that, I basically follow Hegel's idea that logic had not been updated since the ancient world, since Aristotle's time, and that all the other fields had been majorly updated, but logic itself needed to be updated. And that if we didn't bring logic into the modern world, it would just, the basic problem is that we lose the capacity to mediate instinct. And so paradoxically, I think for Hegel, the point of the logic is to mediate instinct. And that is, I think, one of the central problems I see. And what I mean by that practically is things like being able to sustain long-term relationships with the other sex, being able to reproduce the species, because that's basically the foundation of the world. So to me, it's very to the bone, is like, if you cannot sustain long-term relationships with the other sex, if we cannot engage in reproducing the species, then what's really going on here? It's like, so, and that's also, and all of this meta reflectively includes myself. I'm included in all of this. Like, I'm trying to learn how to be a leader. I'm not perfect at it. You can't be perfect at it. I'm trying to find a way to both continue doing what I love and reproduce myself and the species. I don't know, these are ongoing challenges and struggles. And then, so for example, with the next course, the Acree, which starts September 3rd, basically I follow Badiou's idea that if your philosophy has not worked through the psychoanalytic moment, and in this tradition, the Freudo-Lacanian tradition, is that your philosophy is probably unreflexive about masculine and feminine sexual energy, and the logics that are required for masculine and feminine sexual energy to exist.
Mhm.
And so I think that but I also see, I already see tensions and antagonisms with this ontological direction, right? Like there are going to be philosophical reactions to this that don't want to go in this direction, right? Like, but I do see that as an important determination. And I think it is synergistic also with the project of embodying a logic which can mediate instinct, is also being reflexive about sexual energy, being reflexive about life and death, and what it means to think in such constraints.
Mhm. And here I really want to add this because I recently spoke to somebody who is a student at Philosophy Portal and takes your courses. Something that he really appreciates. He said he really appreciates this conference side of it and how participants in the courses are occasionally or routinely invited to write something. And then there's this nurturing process of bringing what they write, editing it, giving feedback, bringing it into fruition, making something from their reflection that is then included in potentially in an anthology. So he was saying that that alone is worth the price of admission. That alone is something. I mean, other than the whole lectures and discussions and seminars, that's incredibly valuable. But the writing aspect, which is also very rare in non-academic settings, that's something that I think you introduced it. That was a very wise decision and something very helpful. Something that I think people have a hunger for that. It's not just intake of philosophical knowledge, it's also the drive to self-expression that you also kind of invite and nurture. And I also look forward to the future fruits of that, this kind of practice with the anthologies.
I think that taking it back to what I was saying about masculine and feminine logic is that it's kind of a combination of both. Is that the courses and in defense, like I just say for a moment, because following here Dave on Theory Underground, like he's done some writing about like in defense of lectures, right? Because in certain universities today there are professors who are like, oh, we all have the same position,
Right.
we're all just going to have a conversation, like I'm not here to lecture you. It's like, no, I am here to lecture, and I've spent several years with these books, and I've been thinking about this for a very long time, and I have a doctorate, and this is something which is increasingly a problem in these spaces, is like, because the internet creates the illusion that we're all just in one network, like there's no respect for, like, I'm 36 and you're 28.
Mm-hmm.
I have a doctorate and you're an undergrad, right? Like these distinctions just all of a sudden disappear. And these are meaningful distinctions, not saying we need to stay to those distinctions exactly, but there need to be some sort of distinctions in regards to teachers and students and how all of that works. Like if we don't have that, we don't have a real lifelong learning process. And it doesn't mean that those categories need to be reified. We need to have processes of advancement and moving forward and taking a course and moving to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
All of that needs to be thought through. But so like the lectures are very, of course, masculine logic. There's a certain thinker we're studying and so forth and training with. But then the feminine logic is, if you're willing to go through that masculine logic, on the other side of things, it's basically the logic of a multiplicity. Everyone's invited, right?
Yeah.
Come, you can present on. I mean, we're constrained by inspiration from a certain line of thought, but you are not constrained by what you want to write about. You can critique, you can deconstruct, you can tear apart, you can put it into conversation with any thinker you like. All of that. It is about it is both about training yourself to be capable of emptying yourself and letting another thinker move through you. And then once that's occurred, then it's time to bring your speculative interpretation to the game. And we do need, and this is like, again, against modern social media, TikTok, Instagram, all the theorygram stuff. I shout out theorygram. Theorygram is fantastic stuff, but it's not conceptual mediation. It's not conceptual mediation. And you know this because you've done a doctorate. Conceptual mediation is 4 years, 5 years working on a topic, right? And day in, day out, laboring in a certain direction where you don't know exactly what the results are going to be, but at the end of the whole process, you're different than when you started. Mm-hmm. And you've built skills through that process. And that's what so I've seen that, like, with students who have been with me from the beginning of Philosophy Portal. There have been many students who, they never wrote anything, they never published anything, and now they published 2 or 3 articles, and they've got a new confidence, and they've got a new capacity to think, and that's a beautiful thing to see happen. Now, in the big picture of things, I would like there to be more structure where I could offer, for example, a graduate scholarship or something like that, where like someone could do a thesis for 2-3 years. Mm-hmm. The way it is right now is that we're in a situation where there are certain students where, after they've published 2 or 3 times over the course of 2 years, 3 years, they basically have the equivalent of like what academia would accept as a doctorate, where you have 3 papers. Like a lot of doctoral programs, basically you need to publish 3 papers, and then put it together, and that's a doctorate. Mm-hmm. So there are some students who are entering that phase where at the end of the next course, or at the end of next year, they're going to have 3 or 4 papers that they could put together as a doctorate, which have been studying over a long course of time. And I just think that experience is so valuable, because if I hadn't gone through that process myself, I wouldn't be where I am now. It just gives you a skill set, and it gives you it trains you and constrains you in such a way as that a new opening appears on the other side of that. Now, it's not you're not open to like I don't know, like a perfect harmony or something. No, you're opened up to new challenges, which are equally arduous and like it's, you know. But anyway, that is, I think that is, you know, whoever the student was to emphasize the conferences and the anthologies. I want to get more creative with that. I'm always thinking about what could be added to what's going on, or what's necessary to add. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just final note is that it has to involve the universal lecture and the singular self-creation. If you get that right, I think that's the sweet spot.
Wonderful. Well, I think this is a good spot to conclude our conversation. Dr. Cadell Last, thank you so much for joining me. Everybody who's listening, I would wholeheartedly recommend getting the book. I am thinking about doing a series of videos based on systems and subjects in 4 parts, corresponding to the 4 parts of the book. Hopefully, I'll get to it in the near future rather than far. But that's something that is on my mind too. Any final thoughts?
That would be a tremendous honor.
Great. No. Likewise for me. Well, thank you again, Cadell. Looking forward to future conversations and future work coming from your pen and the wonderful Philosophy Portal.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I just will say, for anyone who's interested in picking up systems and subjects, I think what that book is going to give you is, on the one hand, a creative engagement between 2 mega discourses. On the one hand, the system science, on the other hand, the continental philosophy. And then, as sort of like an implicit background, what's going on there is sort of like a creative exploration of dialectical and speculative logic. So if you're interested in that type of thing, that's what Systems and Subjects is trying to bring to the conversation. So thanks for having me, Davood.
Thank you.